Hi everyone, welcome back to my tutorial series on creating C++ plugins for Cinema 4D. So in the last tutorial what we did is we created our very first plugin and we created our very first plugin command, and what that did was it added a cube to the scene. That's not very exciting. What we're going to do today is start on adding some UI to your scene, and we're going to make this command pop up a dialog box, and then we're going to be able to dock that dialog in the scene somewhere. So this is like the start of creating any of the UI components that you see within Cinema 4D. All the windows that you see docked around, the object manager, the attribute manager, the material view, they're all dialogues. So we're going to create a dialog. So to do that, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to make that file the file for our dialog. Let me just open up our first plugin here under the source folder. I'm going to right click and click add, and then go new item. And I'm going to make a header file, and I'm going to call this basic dialog, or first dialog. Let's go with the, keep with that first naming. First dialog. Now, this isn't creating it in the source folder, and we actually wanted to create it in the source folder, so I'm going to go browse and get out of that project directory, and I'm going to select this source folder. So it's going to create this file in this source folder here. So that's where we want it to save, and I'm going to click add. I'm just going to copy this first because I'm going to use that name again, and then I'm going to right click and go add new item, and I'm going to create a CPP file with the same name. So we have a .h file and a CPP file. This is what's called a header file, and this kind of describes the interfaces to the underlying code. But I don't really want to go into talking about any of that. First thing I want to do is I'm just going to do some stuff here, and I'm not really going to explain what it is. And there's like two different ways of doing this. One is to use this pragma once, but so I'm going if in def, if, which basically means if not defined, and I'm saying first plugin. I'm just putting this text. Just follow along. Define this. This is probably old school. People may not follow this, but this is still the way I write my plugins. Now, all this is saying to Cinema 4D, or not Cinema 4D, to C++, is saying if it can't find this piece of text, if this piece of text hasn't been listed anywhere in my plugin anywhere yet, when it's reading in these header files, then we define it, and then we break out of it. That's the end of this whole file. And that just means that when C++ is compiling this, and we'll see that we're going to be including this header file in a few places at some point, and when it's compiling, it just only includes it once. It's just a way of making sure you only include this file once when it's trying to load everything up and figure out what to do when it's compiling the code. The other way was, as was written, was to go hash pragma once. That's another way of doing it. It says that only load this once, but I just kind of do it this way. And so I'm going to make a dialog, and the first thing you need to know about any Cinema 4D stuff is you need to include the C4D header, which defines all the stuff, the way of interacting with Cinema 4D itself. So if I go hash include, and in double quotes, C4D.h, this is the main header for Cinema 4D. And if I right click on this and go open document, you're going to see it includes a whole lot of other header files, which in turn have information which allow you to get access to other parts of the Cinema 4D code itself. I can right click on something like object data and go open document. You're going to scroll down. There's going to be a lot of information in here, but this one here is actually what all the objects in Cinema 4D are made of. They're based on. They all what's called derive from this object here. And that's your things like the cubes and the spheres, as well as all the deformers, Pretty much anything you see in the object manager is derived from this. But I'm not going to go into that right now. I'm just kind of giving you a way to get through and try and find some of this stuff yourself. So let's just close down those two files. But that is the file you should include basically at the top of every file that you have, either in the header file or in the C++ file, which is the CPP. Now we want to define our dialog. So I'm going to go class first plugin. Actually, I'm not going to call that first plugin. I named that wrong. First dialog. I tend to keep it with the same naming as the header file. And this is just as a reference. So if I'm ever at the bottom of the file, and this file might be 1,000 lines long, I can see that. So that was a comment there. When you do these two back arrows, it's just a comment. It's just text, and you can write anything you want in here, and it doesn't get included when C++ is compiling the code. So it's a way for you to add notes to your code to just help yourself for documentation purposes. So let's get back to this. It wasn't a first plugin, it was a first dialog. And do a colon there, and then public GE dialog. And this is the dialog class that we're going to be deriving from. And this is what all of the other dialogs in Cinema 4D also derive from. Let's just right click and go to definition on that. Sorry, right click, and I want it to open the file actually. So what we actually need to do is go right click, and so you go to definition, and it's this first one here, C4D GUI. So Dialog doesn't actually have its own initial file. It's part of the C4D GUI header file. And there you can see it's selected, and this is, you can see it says use to display GUI dialogs. Derive this class, overriding necessary functions, and then call open to display it. And this has a whole lot of things in here, but we're only going to use a few of them. Let's come back over to here, public, and copy this text. This is called the constructor. So I won't explain any terminology here that you might be hearing. But what we want to now do is we want to, when this dialog first opens, we want it to do what's called creating a layout, and that describes how this file is going to look. Now again, another way to find this information, instead of going to that header file, because we can be in here, and I'm looking for this method here, so I could come in here and I could copy that, and that's what I will actually do. I'll copy that and I'll just paste it in there, because that's what we're wanting to do. But another way is always to, you can just select this part here, public GE dialog, Control Shift F, again is edit, find and replace, and you go find in files, and that will already be populated when you can go Control Shift F if you've got something selected. So I'll show that again. If I select all this, Control Shift F, you can see that's what my selection there is to find, and click Find All. And it's going to search through all the SDK and everything that we've already got in our project to find other examples of classes. So here's one here, here's a list view dialog, here's a shader browser, and here's just an example dialog. Well, that's quite complex, and a lot of these things are quite complex if you're just looking at them for the first time. So if I can't seem to find anyone that's actually very simple, so that's why I'm kind of avoiding using one of these examples, because they seem overly complex, at least for what we want to do for this particular tutorial. So I'm just going to come back to our header file, and this is all we're going to have, okay? But I'm also going to add this is a destructor. I'm copying that, pasting it, but at the front of this, I'm doing what's called the tilde, and that just signifies this as what's called a destructor. This is called the constructor. So when this is first created, it's going to call this, and then when Cinema 4D shuts down, it will end up calling this one to destroy anything that it might be holding on to some memory or something. But again, don't worry about any of this kind of stuff yet. Now what I'm going to do next is copy all this. So I'm copying just this part here. I'm going over to First Dialog. I'm just going to paste that at the top. Go to the top, and I'm going to go include, and in quotes, First Dialog.h. So now what this is saying to C++ is it's saying when you compile this C++ file, it should look inside this header file for additional information. And that comes in here. And then this one says look in there for additional information. So look in there to find this in this case. And this one is saying look in here to find First Dialog. So the reason I copy and paste this in is because we're going to have methods for each of these class functions. These are functions here, or methods. And you can just follow along with what I'm going to do. You don't need to worry if the terminology is confusing, as I said before. Just follow what I'm doing. And I'm just copying that name, going colon, colon, pasting it again, open bracket, close bracket, and then curly bracket, open and close. And this is our constructor. You don't need to write that comment. I'm just writing that, but it's not actually going to do anything. This is just going to be called, and it's not actually going to do anything. And in some cases, you may not even ever need this, but just for good practice, I always just add it in there anyway, because sometimes you do end up needing it. So I'm doing the same thing here. I'm going to paste that again, and now I'm just going to copy this one here, including the tilde, the squiggle, and that's the destructor. So when our dialog is destroyed, when Cinema 4D gets shut down, it's going to call whatever's written in here. And lastly, we've got this create layout. So I'm going to copy that, put it up here. Copy this, First Dialog, paste it in there, and then open curly brace and close the curly brace. Now, we don't need the word virtual, and I'm not going to explain what that is at the moment. And we don't even need the word void in there either. But we will return true, which says that this was successfully created and it all returned and everything was fine. Now this dialog's not really doing anything at the moment, but what I will do is I'll call set title and I'll give it a name, my first dialog. Go underscore s at the end of that. And that underscore s again just tells Cinema 4D that this is like a string in here that needs to be concerned about. I'm just going to leave that as our dialog. So it's not really doing anything, but when we open this dialog, it's going to have the text set title. That's pretty much all it's going to do at the moment. And now we want to have a way of making this dialog pop up. So to do that, as shown on my last video, we make commands. So commands are all the buttons that you see in Cinema 4D, and when you click on them, when you click on that command, it calls the execute method, which calls this piece of code. And so I want to have a command that's going to pop up that dialog. So what I'm going to do right now is just reuse this command here and make it pop up this dialog instead of creating a cube. Okay, so now we want to add in this first dialog. So to do that, in main, we come up to the top, we type hash include, and in quotes we type first dialog. So it's now told this main file to load in the header file for the first dialog. So we get this interface here to the class, and down inside of our first plugin command, underneath public, actually you don't need public, I'm going to type in the word private at the top. And we go first dialog, I'm going to go underscore diag. So this is a member variable of our class, and what we've added to our first plugin command class is a copy of the first dialog. And what we want now is when the person clicks on execute, we want this dialog to open. So if I come up here, I'm going to delete this code that created the cube. I can even delete the event add. Now I'm going to double click on diag, and paste that here. Now this is just text that describes, I can call this anything. And if you're going to call your your variables in your class, you should give them a name that describes really what it is. A useful descriptive name for yourself, so when you go back. So I could have called this First Dialog if I wanted to, but because I kind of only have one dialog in here, and I don't like typing the whole word dialog, I'm just saying diag, just to make it shorter and easier to type. And that just is what we can use to refer to our first dialog within this class. I hope that made sense, but if not, just keep on carrying on. So we paste that there, we click dot, whereas before you would have been seeing me typing arrows, but this arrow is actually called a pointer, and you only do this if your member variable has a star in front of it, which means it's a pointer. But because there's nothing in front of it, we access that with just a decimal point there. So you press the dot, I just call it a dot, and now you type in open. This is telling the dialog to call this method when we click execute. So it's going to tell it to open. So I'm just going to open that up. And now we need to give the dialog a type. And you can see here you got dialog type. And it's called an enum. And enum stands for enumeration. And all that basically means is if I just was to type DLG underscore type, now go colon colon, you're going to get a list of all the types of dialogues that you or in enum values that you can pass in. And I'm just going to pass in this one called Async. And I need a plugin ID for this. And the plugin ID for this command, I want it to be the same as my first plugin command. So what this is now doing is it's saying when we register, so I'm just going to put that in and then explain it. When we register our command, we're using this ID, which we created in our previous tutorial. And we also want to associate our dialog with that same ID, so that when a dialog pops up, Cinema 4D knows what popped it up and what it's associated with. So I'm using the same ID there, again, as the command. Now this is important for a little bit later when I'll add some code, some additional code in here to kind of remember where your layout was docked in your interface. Because in that instance, if your layout is docked somewhere in the interface and then you click on our command again, it's able to know which dialog relates to that command, and it can pop that part of the interface into your view and bring it into focus. But we'll get to that later. But just the first thing to note here is that when you call open, just give it the same name, the same ID as the register command that you're passing in. Now there's other arguments to this. These are the start position, end position, and the width and height. Now I'm just going to leave those as the defaults, and we'll just see what happens. Okay, so this is pretty much it for popping up a dialog. So now I'm just going to compile this, Control-Shift-B, or you come up to build solution. We've got a warning here. I'm just going to double click on that and have a look. It's got the word void in there. I'm just going to remove that and compile it again. And now we compiled. And now I'm going to run this command. Run Cinema 4D R21, and it's going to load in this plugin. So now, if we've done everything correctly, we come up under extensions. My first command should pop up a dialog. And here we see our dialog. And here we can see its name is my first dialog. So I'm just going to close that again now. Close that again. Go into first dialog. Go into main.cpp. And now I'm going to try setting some of those values. So I want my dialog to come in at an already some sort of size. Now, if you were to fill this dialog with extra stuff, then the dialog would actually resize itself based on the content. But we can add a default width and a default height just at this point, just to make it a little bit more interesting. So I'm just going to go -1, and that's for the X and Y position. And if you use -1, then it's going to just take the position where the mouse is. I think that's what it is. And if we want to figure that out, we can actually go right click on open, go to definition. Actually, I'm going to go back, close that there, right click and go to declaration. And then we can see the documentation there. So if we have -1, the dialog will be opened at the current mouse position. -2, the dialog will be opened at the center of the screen. So how about for this purpose of what we're doing right now, let's make our dialog open. I will leave it at the mouse position, because then wherever you dock it in interface, that's where the dialog is going to appear. So if the button is on the left, you click it, your dialog will appear on the left. If your button is on the right on the interface, you click it, the dialog will appear on the right. So we'll leave that as -1. Now I'm actually switching between these files by just holding down Alt and then clicking W and then clicking 2. So if I hold down Alt, click W, it's going to bring open this menu. And if I click 2, it's going to change to the basically last file I had open. So it's just another quick way of changing between files if you feel like doing it, or otherwise you can come up and select it from here, or you can just select it in your open tabs if you want to as well. But now I want to give that a little bit of width, let's say 200, and a little bit of height, let's say 100. So now I'm going to compile that again, Control-Shift-B, or build solution. When it's ready, we run Cinema 4D. We come up to extensions, my first command, and then we see our dialog, and it's 100 by 200. And here you can see it's got the text, my first dialog. Now this dialog can be docked in the interface. As you can see, I can dock it around, I can put it here. But if I was to save a layout right now and then reload that layout, it would not appear back in this location. So if I do that, if I come up to Window, Customization, Save Layout as First Plugin Layout. And now I'm going to switch to anything. I'm going to switch back to standard. And our dialog is gone. Now I'm going to switch back to First Plugin Layout. And you see it's here, but the text is gone. It's kind of forgotten what was supposed to be in there. So let's change the code now so that it remembers what was actually here, and it'll say the actual text that we're looking for. So I'm going to close this down. And I'll right click on Command Data and go to Declaration. And what we actually want, if I scroll down, is Restore Layout. So I'm copying that, changing back to the header file of to main CPP, and I'm pasting it in for my first plugin command. I'm doing the open curly bracket and close curly bracket there, and now I'm going to go return underscore diag restore layout, and in here I'm going to do the same ID and a sub ID of 0, and I'm just going to write secret. So it's just passing in this information here, which is some secret data from Cinema 4D. I can actually show how to get access to that in another tutorial, and that passes that in. So you don't need to worry about that at all. You don't need to worry about the 0. The main thing here is that we're passing in that ID. so that when this command is run again, it knows it can call this restore layout method, and it will in turn call the dialog restore layout to tell it we're restoring this one, and it's associated with their same ID. Now, if you didn't get any of that, then that's okay. I don't need a colon return there. Then that's okay. But this is the basics of it now. So if I was to compile this and run this now, just compiling, Control-Shift-B as before, and I'm running Cinema 4D. I'm just going to first switch that layout. You can see now it says My First Dialog. So it's remembered, and it knows what it is. So I think that's a good spot for today. What we've added is we've added our very first dialog. We've hooked our dialog up to a command, and we've allowed our dialog to be able to restore itself if it's docked in the UI. And in a future tutorial, I'll add information to this dialog, like buttons and sliders, and then I'll also add in a user area so we can display some images into our dialog.